Hey, my name is Matt Storr and I repair saxophones for a living. Today I would like to show you how a Conn alto or tenor saxophone mechanism is supposed to work. The horns from the teens and the 20s going into the early 30s. So we're talking about the New Wonder Series 1, the New Wonder Series 2, and some of the early transitionals also have this mechanism. Now, if you are a saxophonist or a consumer and not a professional repairman, this is purely for informational purposes because this is a rather complex mechanism that is easily screwed up on what is a finite number of professional saxophones. So please don't attempt to mess with this yourself. I usually don't say that, but I'm going to start saying that more the more I get into talking about actual repair procedures. So this is for educational purposes, so you can kind of look at your mechanism, see if it's working the way it should, and also know what to expect if you're getting a repair done, and also understand why getting a Conn octave mechanism right might cost more than getting your brand new Yamaha octave mechanism right. And if you are a repairer, perhaps you don't see many of these, so this can serve as a sort of reference point. Maybe you can get some ideas, or maybe you can offer some feedback as ways to make this even better, or the different way you do it that works just as well. Because I'm not like the final authority on this stuff. I've just figured it out as I go along. So here's the method I've figured out, right? And this is how this should look. So the first thing you have to do if you want to get this octave mechanism right, which is comprised of several different parts, right? We'll call this part here the actual octave key, right? The octave button, let's say. This is the rocking lever, right? See, that rocks back and forth. This is the body octave pad. You got your neck octave key, which is basically really not involved in the operation here. On a lot of saxophones, you need the spring power of the neck to actuate this part here, or the equivalent part. Like Selmer octave mechanisms don't work without the neck, but some octave mechanisms work without the neck, and the Conn mechanism is one of them. Also, SML mechanisms work without the neck, among others. So we'll take the neck out just to make it a little easier for me to handle this. But then you've got the G arm, so this is the G key here, right, which down here on this side, down here is the pad and the key. And you got this long solid bar coming up to what is a relatively small piece of hinge tubing right here that goes down to this arm that does two things. That arm does two things. When it lifts up off of this back here, it allows, if the octave key is depressed, it'll allow the body octave pad to lift up. The second thing it does is that it holds the rocker closed, right? So if I press the octave key without it and then hit the G, it closes this, which closes the neck key and opens the body key, because the G is where your octave pips switch. A and above, it uses your neck key. G and below, it uses your body octave pip. Okay, so this is a Conn New Wonder Series 2, and I apologize if my voice is rather flat. I'm a little bit under the weather, but this being a gold-plated keys, silver body horn that I just finished up an overhaul on, it's really easy to see what's going on here, so I figured I'd use this to make this video. So, those are the main parts of the octave mechanism, and you've got three springs, basically. You got one here on the octave key, you've got one on the rocker, and then you've got one on the body octave pad. You've also got one on the neck, although that is the neck is kind of disconnected from this mechanism, so we don't really need to consider it, except for making sure that when it is assembled, that there's not much lost motion. You need like about a ½ millimeter of space right here just to make sure that, regardless of position that it's in, that you've got enough room. But that you need about a ½ millimeter space between this key and the actuating lever here, the rocker. But once you've got that correct, you can basically leave the neck out of the equation. And then you've got the G key, which has its own spring, right? So you've got all these different things acting in concert to do what? Well, when you press this button, if you're playing A and above, it'll lift up the neck octave key. If you're playing G or below, or G sharp or below, I guess I should say, then it opens up this key on the body here. And what that's doing is interrupting the airflow at a certain point to make you overblow the octave, hence being called the octave key. And that is an automatic octave mechanism that switches back and forth between those two pips. Now ideally, acoustically, you'd have one octave pip exactly in the right spot for every note you're going to play. But that would obviously be fiendishly complex mechanically, so we've got two on most saxophones. A few saxophones like the Conn 28M, Holton baritone, and I know there's more I'm missing right now, have 3 octave pips, and then a couple have 4, like the Buffet Powell and some modern saxophones. But most of the saxophones you ever see are going to have 2 pips, right? And so the purpose of this mechanism is to switch back and forth automatically when you depress the G from the neck key to the body octave pip, right? Now, there's lots of different ways this has been done. This is the way Conn did it for about 20 years, right? And when you see these octave keys, a lot of times these feel really bad on Conns. And that's why I'm making this video, is because in order to make these feel good, 2 things have to happen. 1, your repairer has to understand how to do it. 2, and a little bit probably less common, is that you, as the person owning the saxophone, have to understand that this is a much more complex mechanism that takes a lot more work to get feeling good than a lot of modern stuff. So you have to, usually on vintage saxophones, you have to spend a bit more to get it to feel the way it can. But a lot of times that doesn't happen. Either the repairer doesn't know that they need to charge more, or the people don't want to pay more because they just got Grandpa Sax out of the attic, can you make it work? And then the mechanisms don't function as well as they possibly can, and then people unfairly judge them against brand new saxophones that are in much better operating condition. They say, oh, vintage saxophones just feel bad. But if you look at this mechanism, right, when I'm touching the G key here, listen how quiet that is. See how there's no lost motion? From a playing perspective, when this mechanism is in proper operating condition, you cannot tell that this is any different than any other mechanism. It's not gummy, it's not loud, you can't feel things sliding against each other, you can't feel the different mechanisms working. There's really no way to tell when you're playing this saxophone that if you've got the octave key depressed and you hit the G, that all this other stuff is happening. I mean, look at how complex that is, what's going on there. When I hold the octave key down and I open the G, I close the G, so many different things are moving at once, but from the perspective of the player, I only feel, it just feels like I'm just closing the G key. There's no like lost motion, there's no bump, there's no like 6 different, even if I do it really slow, everything's just moving as one. Okay, and that's the goal with octave mechanisms, is for everything to move as one. Otherwise, you get the thing where you depress a key, it goes, or you let go of a key, it goes, and that feels really bad. And these mechanisms usually feel that way because of what I said before, where people don't spend enough time on them. Plus, they're 80, 90, almost 100 years old at this point. So this should serve as a sort of reference point to show you what these can feel like. Now, the first thing you have to do if you want your octave mechanism on an old Conn to feel good is you have to get your keys fit. That means this guy, this guy, this guy, and your G. Especially this little tiny hinge tube here. It has to be perfectly tight around the hinge rod that runs through this. These keys have to be perfectly tight as well. If this isn't perfectly tight around the rod here, then when this gets actuated from this lever here, it's just going to pull this up, right? It's just going to make this rock down here. And as I hope you can see, you can't, this is not moving at all. It's completely free, right? Completely quiet. But it is not moving in any way other than rotationally. It doesn't move up and down this way. It doesn't flex around the rod. The rod is tight within the posts. That has to be on all of these keys if you want this to feel well. For instance, on this key, right, on your body octave key, or body octave pad key, it's being actuated here from the spring here, and then this little tiny arm underneath here on the G, right? If this is not completely tight, when the G presses down on it, the key will go like this. Right? So the whole thing will move before anything else happens. You cannot have that. This has to be completely tight. I mean, I'm bending the key a little bit, moving it. You know, it's brass, it's not bending it permanently, so it's flexing a little bit, but it is completely tight, right? No clicking, no movement, no nothing, right? That's the first thing that has to happen, is the mechanics have to be perfect, okay? Once that happens, then you can make this mechanism look like this. Okay, so basically you've got to start off with either a horn that is in perfect mechanical condition, because we're talking about, you know, a 90-year-old horn, or you got to be doing a mechanical rebuild on it. So I just did a mechanical rebuild on this horn, and that's why this horn, you know, looks the way it does right now. So when you're making this mechanism work right, it's actually very easy to do if you do it in the correct order, and the correct order is this, at least as far as I know. Okay, you do your stack first. This is the upper stack where all of your upper stack keys are connected, right? So you complete your upper stack first, and that means seating the octave pad, seating your G pad, and then you set the height of the G pad with the, let's see, can we even see it here? Okay, yeah, there it is. Okay, down in here, this is the arm coming off the back of the G, and this piece of adjustment material rests on this right here, which is the body octave pad. Okay, so you get your G height correct. You can see the brass flexing a little bit there as it goes down, and that's just the that's just the brass flexing. Imagine if this wasn't tight, how much more movement you'd have. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about when you've got to get this mechanism correct, because just with all these little thin little tabs and stuff interacting, the brass moves. If it's not completely tight, then it is going to move way more than that, and there's no way you're going to get this mechanism to feel correct. Okay, so the first thing you do once you get your upper stack seated is you're going to set your G key height, and you're going to set that with a relatively soft piece of adjustment material that rests on this octave arm, or on this like little tab coming off the body octave pad here, right? So that little tab, here's your body octave pad, goes up here, and the little tab is down in here. Okay, now when that moves, it doesn't slide, so you can have a relatively soft piece of material there. Okay, so that's the first thing you do. Now the next thing you do is you add this key here, the body like octave rocker. Okay, and you put a piece of material on the top side of the G arm here. I use something firm with that's laminated with Teflon, so that when I close the G, it holds this key fairly closed. Okay, and there's a little bit of space. There'll be a little bit of space here in the body, right? So you put the spring on this key. It's going to hold itself open. You close the G, and you add the adjustment material here, right? So that it nearly closes this key against the body, against the tenon here. And then you add a piece, and then once you figure out where that is, you add a piece of adjustment material that just fills that gap. You don't want it to be too tight. You don't want there to be any like extra motion. If I squeeze it, there's a little bit of extra room to squeeze. That's what you want, right? But you want that to actually be contacting the body. Okay? So now you've got your stack put on, and you've got your G key to where it is set to the correct height with a piece of adjustment material underneath, and that it is closing this key against the body with a perfectly spaced piece of adjustment material here. And you've got that set. The next thing you do is then you add this key here, right? And this is where it gets a little bit more complex, getting everything to work correctly. So this key, the way it interacts with everything is, let's see, okay. So you've got a piece of adjustment material right here that holds this key shut, right? So if I am not activating the octave key, but I actuate the G, the G lifts up off that octave, body octave key, which has a spring underneath it. This holds it shut, right? If that's not on there and I open the G, body octave key opens, okay? So you've got a piece of adjustment material. I use something quite firm, laminated with Teflon, because it slides. See how it slides across that sharp top edge there? Okay, and the second thing it does is right here, another piece of adjustment material, and it's not touching here, by the way. It looks like it is, but it's not. The other place it's touching is right here. There's another piece of adjustment material right here that holds this tab down. And what that is a piece of this rocker key here, right? So when the octave key opens, it lifts off that and allows that rocker key to move. Okay? So when this is at rest, when everything's installed and this is at rest, has to hold this down perfectly, has to hold the body octave key down perfectly, and it has to hold the rocker down perfectly, right? It's hard to get that adjustment material to show up because it's black. Alright? Now, the trick is to get it so that when you open up the G, or when you close the G, right, so that the G tab lifts up, and then you add the octave key, that rocker doesn't move at all. And also so that the travel of the body key, when you open that up, that little tab underneath the G comes all the way up and touches the G. So you see when I've got the G depressed and the octave key depressed, the top and bottom of this G tab are in contact with the components of the octave mechanism. See that? So what that means is when I have the octave mechanism depressed and I move the G, I can't feel anything else moving. It's not going, like if I partially open this and then I were to depress the G, boom, boom, that feels awful to have that lost motion in there. And that is what most Conn octave mechanisms feel like when you just pick one up off the street, right? Usually that's the condition they're in, is all that lost motion and gum, right? Like that. If you look at your octave mechanism, chances are that's what you're dealing with. But the way it should be is when it's fully depressed, the G is contacted on both sides. So when you depress that G, it feels monolithic, right? You can only feel one thing moving. And what that mechanism is doing then, I've got the octave key depressed, and I add the G, it lets the body key open, and it closes the neck key. And what that also means is if I've already got the G depressed, if I already have the G depressed, right, it's already touching that little tab on the body octave rocker. So when I add the octave key, all that's moving is the body octave, right? I'm not getting any like flex or fuss from that body rocker there in the middle. Now if I were to like open the G just a little bit to like introduce some extra motion in there and then depress the octave key, you can see what Conn mechanisms usually look like. Okay, so here's correct, and then I'm going to introduce a little bit of play. See how that rocker's moving when it shouldn't? And that feels awful. You can see even that the octave key is not moving very fast. It feels really terrible under the fingers. But then I close the G. It's as fast and as firm as anything else. Now, the way you adjust this is by having the correct thickness of materials where you need it, right? So the parts that I pointed out. The bottom of the G key holds this shut when the G key is open. The top of the G tab touches this when the G is depressed. Whoops. And then the adjustment materials on here hold this shut and hold this shut perfectly at the same time when the octave key is not depressed. But when it is depressed, see that travel there? And watch this. So depress the octave key, add the G, and look, the body octave key stops when it touches the, on this side we already talked about, the tab is right up against the bottom of the G. Also, it's connected here now. Hits both those places at the same exact time. So when I release the octave key, there's no lost motion, right? So let me go ahead and introduce some lost motion by opening up the G, or letting the G open a little bit. That's what it would look like if it wasn't right. See how that curved arm opens up higher than the body octave key does? And that feels terrible, and it's basically not functioning because the springs aren't strong enough to overcome all these like additional issues. But when it's in proper operating condition, it's fast, it's snappy, it works perfectly. Okay, so a lot of times what will have to happen is that when this isn't in perfect operating condition, these springs are set super strong to overcome all that slop I showed you. Or if these adjustment materials aren't slick enough, aren't hard enough, if it's not laminated with Teflon, then you have to make the springs really strong again. So you end up with a really, really strongly sprung mechanism here that still feels like absolute garbage. But this is sprung fairly lightly, and so is the G, and it still works perfectly because my adjustment material is set up correctly. Now, sometimes you might find that you actually have to bend some of this stuff to make it work right. Now, the places you might have to bend would be this little tab right here. Sometimes it's going to be bent down this way or bent up this way. And ideally you shouldn't have to do that, but maybe it's been bent in the past, and you might have to find a place, because if you bend it this way, it's closer to the fulcrum of the G. If you bend it this way, it's farther from the fulcrum of the G, right? So it changes the amount of travel that this has to go through to meet the G. Similarly, this little tab right here, that little guy right there, if you bend it this way, it brings it farther away from the fulcrum of this key, which is where it's being actuated, right? If you bend it this way, it brings it closer to the fulcrum of the key. So if you bend it this way, this will travel less. If you bend it this way, this will travel more. So, and this one is the one that usually, if you have to bend anything, that's going to be the one that gets bent, and it's just going to get bent this way or that way, just a hair, right? And that's just to make it so that when you depress this, everything is touching the way it's supposed to touch, okay? But do that stuff last, right? Try and get your adjustment materials right first, and then if you have to do a little bit of bending, I mean, this one in particular, this key, this little part right here, that is designed, I mean, the design of that is because it can bend, right? Otherwise, they just would have had a tab coming right off of here, right underneath it. They made it on this arm here so that you can bend it backwards and forwards. And that's basically like the master adjustment of this entire mechanism is this little tab that'll bend this way or that way. But you only need to do it like a hair. And if you don't do it right, then you're just going to cause this all to bind, right? So make sure everything else is correct first before you go bending this. If you have to bend anything, that's probably going to be the piece, and it'll be at the very end of the job after you've got everything else in the octave mechanism set up, but you just can't get it to line up to where when you depress this, it touches the G, and also when you open or when you close the G, that the body octave key hits the curved arm. Sometimes you'll see that someone in the past has bent this curved arm, particularly if you see like plier marks on top here, like big dents along the way. Someone has then like adjusted that arc to try and make the octave mechanism work better, so you may have to put that back correct. But you know, you can have the thickness of your adjustment material under here. Oops. You can have the thickness of this adjustment material here be tapered from front to back, so you can functionally change the curve of this arm by tapering your stuff, either making it thin here and thick here, or thin here and thick here, right? Because it slides when it acts. So, alright, so fairly complex. My name is Matt Storr. I repair saxophones for a living. Hopefully this video was helpful, useful, informative. My camera's telling me I'm almost run out of time, so I am going to go ahead and end this at about the 25-minute mark. Hopefully this demystifies and not mystifies the Conn octave mechanism. It works great when it's in proper operating condition. It's just not exactly intuitive. Thanks for watching.